Good afternoon. I am Pascal Doptin, Global Advertising Product Director at the New York Times Company, and I would like to welcome you to our Conference of the Trees at the New York Times Climate Hub. I'm thrilled to be introducing this session, A Picture Worth 1,000 Words, Visual Arts and Climate Change. But before I hand over to my superb colleague, Whitney Richardson, I'd like to take a minute to say a few words and thank YouTube for sponsoring this session. Before the session, we'll play a short video, and I would like to remind our digital audiences that they can submit their questions online. Thank you.
It's a global issue. Climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. It's going to hit those who have done the least to cause this issue the hardest.
The developed countries in the world have created this crisis, and the people who are paying most as a consequence are the poorest people in the world. What a gross injustice.
I'm speaking with those who don't have a seat at the political table, gathering stories on my journey to COP26 in Glasgow, where I'll show them to world leaders, the decision makers who hold the future of life on Earth in their hands.
Hope isn't just sitting back, wishful thinking. Hope for the future depends on each one of us doing our bit.
This is where we go.
We need to hear from the people who are on the front lines of this issue. We're stronger when we work together.
We have a very short window. Our survival is at stake.
Together we can achieve this. This issue has never felt more urgent. And there's never been a more important time to take action.
Am I sitting here?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I get emotional watching that YouTube video, especially with our dear friend Jack here up in the front row. Really excited about that, Jack, and congratulations. My name is Whitney Richardson, and thank you for joining today's session titled A Picture Worth 1,000 Words, where we will discuss the role of visual arts, photography, and video can play in shaping popular culture and consciousness and mobilizing climate action. I'm currently the international events manager, but before this role, I was a photo editor working at the New York Times in New York, where I had the opportunity to work with hundreds of photographers for many years to capture stories in a different way, through photography, through data, through video. And I'm excited to be speaking to our panelists today, who are all experts in the field, about how they've used the medium of photography and video to tell stories on climate change. One of the things that I like to do when I'm introducing panelists is to ask a rapid-fire question. So I will do that as I introduce our speakers. The first one being Miss Alice Aedy. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Alice is the co-founder of Earthrise Studio, and is a documentary photographer, filmmaker, and campaigner using multimedia creative storytelling for social impact. Her human stories focus on forced migration, women's stories, and environmental issues. Now, Alice, your rapid-fire question is?
Oh God, here we go.
What is one word to describe your relationship with photography?
My relationship with photography. Okay, the word that comes to mind is empathy. That would be what I'm trying to create through my work in storytelling. Thank you for having me, by the way. We survived COP, it's the last day. I just want to say thank you because you guys have put on such an incredible series of events, and I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you.
And hi, you guys up there.
Hello, hello. So empathy. Empathy is Alice's word with her relationship with photography. I would like to now introduce my colleague at the top, Josh Hayner. Josh is joining us from San Francisco. He's a staff photographer, and his new title is photofuturist. And Josh, I want you to explain what a photofuturist is today as we get into your work, because that is the coolest title I've ever heard at the New York Times. He was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Feature Photography and has spent the last 7 years working across the globe to document the pressing and wide-ranging realities of climate change. Now, Josh, your question is, if you could photograph in one location anywhere in the world, where would it be?
I'll just echo Alice. Thanks so much for having us, Whitney, and I'm sorry I'm not on stage. I have 2 young children here that are still sleeping, and as it's the sun has not yet risen in San Francisco. But in terms of where I would go, I've had the opportunity to visit many places and go up in the air as well as underground or underwater in covering the climate. But I think the place that I'm most interested in is the rainforest canopy, be it in Malaysia or Brazil. I just think that's a story that I haven't seen told visually well yet, especially as it relates to sort of the after effects of the fires that have been burning through the Amazon and places like that. I think it's an area ripe for exploration visually.
Well, I look forward to seeing your images from that area when you get to it. Thank you for being here. And lastly, the beautiful Miss Lydia Kibandi joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Lydia. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for having us, Whitney.
Absolutely. Lydia is the Chief Executive Officer of Lensational, a nonprofit social enterprise that aims to elevate voices of underrepresented women through photography. Lydia has also earned recognition as a young leader in her country through a nomination in Kenya's Business Daily Top 40 Under 40 Women in Leadership in 2019. Lydia, your question is, who is the one person who has influenced your photography practice the most?
I wish I could narrow it down to Josh or or Alice. But as you mentioned, we work with women from underrepresented groups and communities from all across the globe. And my experience, in particularly with Maasai women from here in Kenya, has really challenged my thinking. I suppose in the hierarchy of women that we work with, the Maasai women have more odds stacked against them. Not only can they not read and write, we don't speak the same language, but their realities almost have them not having access to technological advancements or the internet where they can Google stuff. So just thinking through personally and also as an organization, how do we ensure that we are facilitating the best conditions for these women that we consider the real experts has challenged my thinking in photography, and I would say that that has really shaped my photographic experience.
I love that. Thank you so much, Lydia, and I can't wait to see more of the work that you've been doing with these women. So I'm going to turn to Alice for our first question. I know you've had a super busy few weeks. You've been running around the Blue Zone, the Green Zone, the Climate Hub. You've had a seat at the table at COP. You've talked to many world leaders, and you've listened as they've made their climate pledges. You also were out in the streets during the protest and spoke to a lot of activists who were in town this week protesting in the streets, calling for meaningful climate action and change. You consider yourself a climate and social justice photographer, which I find very interesting. And I'm curious, what role do you think photography has in climate activism? And how do you balance the two in your practice? And if you can talk through that and tell us a little bit about how you've gotten started, that would be fantastic.
Just a small question then. Okay, let me get into it. So yeah, the past few days we've been very lucky to be here at COP showing multiple projects, including Seat at the Table, which is the trailer that was shown just before. And I feel really passionate about the subject of this talk because in a way I'm relentlessly, naively passionate about the power of the image. And my journey really started with a single image, and that was, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a tragic photograph or series of images of a young boy called Aylan Kurdi in 2015 who was drowned on European shores. And I just finished studying at university, and it literally was an image that changed the course of my life. It made me wake up to this crisis that was very much on European doorstep. And I decided I had to do something. I had grown up really passionate about, I'd studied history and politics. I guess I wanted to tell stories, but I knew it would be through the visual medium. And so I was 21 and started to document the refugee crisis across Europe, across the Middle East, Serbia, Iraq, and Lebanon. And I realized how passionate I was about using portraiture to build connections, build empathy for audiences for whom...
We've got a portrait here.
So this is later on. So the refugee crisis sort of was a big turning point for me. I was tunnel vision focused on that issue for a few years. And it was actually when I realized that climate change was going to cause the biggest mass migration in history. It was a real penny drop moment. I'd never been engaged with climate change. I'd never really thought about it. And I realized, right, we're not telling enough human stories about this issue, and we're not making that connection that this is a human rights and social justice issue. You know, we've seen the David Attenborough documentaries, and we've fallen in love with nature, but are we making that very important social justice point that those who've done the least to cause it are disproportionately impacted? So my work with refugees would then draw me to climate front lines. We saw images earlier from Kiribati, an island in the Pacific. This portrait is from a series in Somaliland during a drought in 2017, impacting East Africa. And that work on climate front lines became deeply personal because, you know, when you meet communities experiencing this for whom it's already a life and death challenge, it's a serious wake-up call. So I started to shift, I guess, into campaigning and using the images for advocacy, and that was a change.
Tell us about this campaign, which I'm learning now about the forgotten refugees.
So this is examples of our work with Earthrise. So my activism in the street, I guess you could say, led us to it was July last year, in the midst of a pandemic, a massive outcry against racial injustice, the continuing worsening climate crisis. And in a way, I was forced into isolation, as we all were. I couldn't get on a plane and start photographing international stories. So I was like, how can I actually use the visual medium and photography, but in a completely different way? And so me and two co-founders set up Earthrise, which is a creative studio and production company, and we are focused on climate storytelling, using data, using articles, repackaging them to make climate information more accessible. I know how overwhelmed I felt learning about these stories, making it human, really doing justice to how intersectional the issue is, telling human stories, and ultimately really with the aim of harnessing hope and optimism and trying to give people the profound sense that there is something to fight for here, that there is an opportunity on the other side of this, that if we talk about hope and we talk about optimism, I think people have lost sight that another world is possible. We're so focused on dystopia and we're so focused on the sacrifices that we have to make. But to me, I'm really passionate about using photography, using the visual medium to move people beyond despair and into action. And that's kind of been the journey. I don't know if I've answered your question, but in a way, I wonder whether I've used both. It has been more journalistic at times, and now it's more with a campaign focus to inspire action, to inspire people who maybe know there's an issue but don't know what to do about it, feel powerless. And that's what I'm doing now through Earthrise.
And what's the response been? Obviously, I know you guys use social media quite a bit for your campaigning. Yeah. Earthrise, that movement came through social media and the awareness around that. Are you looking for TV? Are you looking for print medium, essentially for coverage, or is your main tool of accessing communities really through social media? Like, what are your platforms?
It really depends on the project. So we've built a foundation of an audience on social media. We've felt that people are responding really well. You know, we call our audience the climate curious, those who, yes, as I said, know there's an issue but don't know how to take action, and we're trying to engage them and make them feel empowered with information rather than powerless. We are also making, film series like the YouTube originals. So we recently partnered with Penguin, who released an environmental modern classic series, so it really depends. And all the while, I'm sort of adapting the format and the medium of the work that we make, depending on the impact that we want to have. What is the story we want to tell? Who's the audience that we want to impact? And yeah, it depends.
It depends, yeah. I know that a lot of people are, and a lot of young people think about, when they think about the newspaper and about television, that's not really the platforms that they choose to use anymore to get their information out. And actually, platforms like Instagram and YouTube are more applicable to getting visual medium out.
100%, and that's the audience we're talking about. So many young people now are finding out about the climate crisis, engaging with the climate crisis through social media, and that's really the kind of platform that we're leveraging. But it's far from perfect, and it's, yeah.
We've talked about that. So speaking of newspapers and getting information out, Josh, you've been in the news business for a long time. You came up as a junior photographer and have worked your way up, doing remarkable work, getting a Pulitzer against all odds for your work in New York. And I guess now I'm thinking about how you're also a photofuturist. You've introduced the Times to drone photography to capture climate change and the impacts of climate change. Tell us about how you've used new forms of technology to push the boundaries of visual journalism to capture this story. And tell us about your process for that.
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. I'm very passionate about telling stories about climate change. And having worked at the New York Times now for 15 years, I've sort of worked on many climate projects along the way. And early on, we conceptualized the imagery around climate change in a very sort of generic way. We would feature the lone polar bear on the last piece of ice in the Arctic or a calving glacier. And so what I really started trying to do was to push the visual narrative further. And similar to Alice, I sort of started with a project that I think we're going to show some pictures of now in Greenland. And this, I think, was my introduction to sort of the despair type of imagery that Alice was describing. This was one of my first attempts to show how we could lead with visuals to try to bring our audience into what I feel is one of the most important stories in our history. So I think we have a picture here of a plane that I flew in to the top of Greenland's ice sheet. That's 10,000 feet above sea level on top of a frozen cache of fresh water, the second largest cache of frozen fresh water on the planet behind Antarctica. And scientists say that the full melt of Greenland's ice sheet could raise global sea levels by 20 feet. And so I went there to document a research station on the top of the ice sheet. And you'll see through the next, if you just want to click through the next few pictures, as you fly over Greenland's ice sheet, it's beautiful. But when you look down and you see these pockets of blue amidst all what should be a completely white frozen sheet of ice, you recognize that it is melting in real time while you're flying over it. And you start to see these lakes that are gathering on the surface, and the lakes lead to rivers, and those rivers lead to giant holes like a Swiss cheese in the ice sheet, and eventually out into the ocean, contributing to sea level rise. And what I wanted to do was try to look at that story. And so I'm unable to see the visuals, but there's a photo of the helicopter, and this is a research scientist, Larry Smith, whose entire life's work revolves around monitoring or theorizing how much water is leaving Greenland's ice sheet every minute of every day. So I flew out with his team onto the ice, and we can just move through the pictures up until there's a video that I wanted to show. And this is their camp on the top of the ice sheet, where they're monitoring one watershed and trying to theorize how much water is coming out of this one lake. And so their researchers ran a boat across the outflow that was mounted with sensors to try to see, in the next frame, you can see the researchers actually moving moving the boat across. And they found that at one moment there was 430,000 gallons of water per minute flowing out of just this one lake. And so my challenge was to try
Josh,
to...
I remember you said that this wasn't even the story that you came out to report on, right? This was an accident that you stumbled upon this.
Yeah, from flying over the ice sheet and seeing these lakes, we were lucky to find the researcher who was involved in this work. And I was blown away with just the beauty and also the tragedy of what I was seeing. And so my goal was to try to bring this to the readers and to people that'll never be able to fly an hour out in a helicopter on Greenland's ice sheet. So I had just trained with a drone as part of a partnership with the FAA while we were lobbying for rules, for drone rules for journalists. And this next video is the first one that I actually made with a drone on assignment for the New York Times. And what I wanted to do was to put our readers there and to sort of fly along this outflow river and recognize just the scale of what you're seeing. And I felt like there's no better way than this first-person view of a drone to do that. But so this is what we led the article with. And then the next slide that I want to show is what we did with the data that the scientists gave us from their research. And so this next graphic that we put together, it starts with a satellite view of Greenland's ice sheet. And we zoom all the way down to fixed drone mapping of the watershed that I was visiting. And we really are trying to give a sense of this scale through this, and also start to show our readers more data as you zoom in. And now we're getting to the camp. And once we went in, we thought it was important to then bring them out. And this was actually our main storytelling apparatus for this piece. And I'm hoping we're seeing it zoom back out so that you can see how the scientists were able to extrapolate data from this one watershed and make a guess on how much water is leaving the entire Greenland ice sheet. And this was a very new thing for the New York Times to do in our climate coverage. And what Alice was saying that touched me so much, she said she wanted to get beyond despair. And so the next photo or the next video to show is an actual view of the Marshall Islands. So this is in the South Pacific, and this is a view of a community called Aedy. And you can see the high tide just almost inundating this island here. And so I wanted to look at people's stories, and I think that's where Alice got to also. And so the next video is actually part of our series on climate, migrants, and refugees from Bolivia. And this is a man standing in what was once Bolivia's second largest lake called Lake Popo. And the drone really allowed us to give this sense of scale to this place and just see the boats that had just been abandoned when the lake finally dried up. And so then the challenge was, here we are operating way outside of traditional, or not traditional, but where our readers live. And so the next video that I'll show, this is in Santa Rosa, California, and this is the aftermath of forest fires. This is 30 minutes from my home in San Francisco, and this is a community that was completely decimated by fire. And the drone's also allowing you to really experience that. And from those communities, we then went and looked at natural and cultural heritage sites around the world. And so the next video is of Easter Island, and these are the statues that line the coast that are in the face of rising seas and being threatened by this inundation of water. And so these are communities that are really trying to protect their heritage. And from these cultural relics, we then went to the natural world, and this is the last video of the Galapagos Islands. And one of the amazing things about the Galapagos is it's a bellwether for the rest of the world, as it sits at the intersection of the major currents in the Pacific Ocean. And so it's sort of, we're seeing a lot of what we're seeing happen there can also be extrapolated to what we're going to be experiencing. It's the first indication that we're getting of how warming seas are going to affect the ecosystems around the world.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Josh. And I've seen your work many, many times, and every single time I see it, I see something different. And there's this power of getting imagery from above, right? And getting information from a drone. I know that it cannot be easy, the regulations that you've had to go through, even getting a drone across California, across your neighborhood. Tell us some of the stories of like, how are you getting access to these environments? What are some of the craziest stories that you've had to experience? I know when you went to the Galapagos, there was lots of paperwork that you needed to file. What has been that experience for you?
Yeah, and the Galapagos was probably the most challenging just because until a week before I went, the government had said absolutely no drones would be allowed. So I learned how to scuba dive for that story and went underwater to tell the story about marine iguanas and some effects on the sardine population there. But then got the green light, but it required me taking along a park ranger and an animal behaviorist to make sure flying the drone wouldn't negatively impact the populations on these islands. And so that was one story. I mean, the other is in Bolivia, just to gain access to this community took multiple trips before I even arrived by our reporters to convince the community to allow us to come stay with them, and also to explain the drone as a flying camera, because they were going to see this over their communities, and we really wanted to work with them to make sure that it was appropriate and that they were empowered to feel a part of this story as well.
Oh,
absolutely.
I'm such a fan.
I mean, honestly.
I'm an uber fan, Josh. So cool. And it's like, I guess in a way we're doing similar things. We're trying to innovate and tell stories in a different way because it hasn't necessarily been working, the storytelling that we've done. It's in this binary of either hope or fear, and we know it's so urgent that we need to engage people not only with their heads but with their hearts. We have to emotionally engage people, and to innovate the way that you are, Josh. I love those interactive pieces on the New York Times. We have to try new things, we have to innovate, we have to use every tool at our disposal to engage people in a way that they haven't been engaging.
And I do think that Josh has hit a chord with that, and working close with our graphics team. Yeah. I know, Josh, you've said before that when we build stories as the first Greenland piece, that data then gets built on top of for the next piece and the next piece, and you're using code, you're building on code on the back end so that each piece gets even more intense and even more sophisticated. Explain to us a little bit about how on the coding side and on the graphic design side, how that works and how you collaborate with the graphic design team to capture data and to tell stories in this way.
Yeah, part of my role as the photo futurist of the New York Times is to look at new technologies and identify what parts of them we can really use to innovate in our storytelling. Every new technology that comes along, even visual ones, they're not immediately needing to be integrated into our storytelling. They don't always, like when VR came out, I didn't quite see a role for that in our climate reporting. So we're trying to analyze the different technologies, and now working with photogrammetry and LiDARs mounted to drones, we're able to really create these really visceral maps that we can fly our readers through virtually. And so that's something that we're experimenting a lot with now, is to create these three-dimensional models of different places, some impacted by climate, some and natural disasters, and sort of use the motion as that storytelling, the way to weave our storytelling. And that's where a lot of my research right now is to recreate these spaces in a story form so that you can experience them.
Yeah, no, it's important work, and you're setting the foundation of what people will, and journalists will be using for years to come, so it's incredible. Lydia, I want to bring you in. It's been a real big topic of discussion over the last 2 weeks about giving voices to people on the front lines, giving voices to people, an agency to people who are experiencing climate change in real time. Your work with Lensational gives underrepresented women the opportunity to be trained to tell visual stories on their own account. You're giving people agency to learn how to use cameras, video for film, and then giving them platforms to then share their stories. Tell us about that work and what you've been doing there.
Just as you mentioned, we train women from underrepresented communities and groups really in photography and storytelling, and then equipping them with the proper tools for that. So just having, for them having the cameras, and it's so interesting to see how they light up when they first hold a camera, and the experience that they have just kind of, you know, unearthing these new realms that are within them through the photography and through the imagery that they are creating. And therefore, I think that would be how we go about it, and also just exploring, you know, partnerships, and I'll maybe talk about this later, or platforms that are able to bridge these women who are often in areas where they can't even watch these, and then us who are up here and who have connectivity, just bridging that gap is what we aim to do at Lensational.
So talk us through some of the images that you have here. Who photographed them? What was the process in getting these images across, and where have they been published? How are you using this work?
All right, I think I would love to first and foremost just explore how photography has played a role in these women being able to share their stories, especially on the role of climate change. First, I think indeed the photographers that we are working with are women who feel the impacts of climate change every day in their daily lives in a very tangible way. And while we are in more urban settings and we're not necessarily in situations where the impacts of climate change shape our days, the women that we work with, this is the case. And then second, what has been very fascinating to understand is that they are not engaged in the climate conversation. Their realities are happening totally separately from the climate movement. And we really get to see this even in when we speak to them. When we meet them, our conversations do not revolve around carbon emissions or adaptation plans. We are talking completely different languages. Their language is not necessarily like impregnated with the climate action movement. The way they speak about it is more so in how it affects them, but they aren't, most of the times they're not aware that there is a movement trying to curb these issues that they are going through. And they're not aware that they could be part of it and could play a role in it. They're simply just trying to deal with it at their own level. And for some of the images that you're mentioning, I have particularly just observed this with the Maasai women that we're working here in Kenya. We're working with, here in Kenya. Climate change is shaping their day-to-day lives in every aspect of their lives. You know, as a community that heavily relies on the environment and whose mainstay is livestock, the prevailing drought in our country is greatly being felt amongst them. Not only is it frustrating their main source of income and as such sustenance, but also something as simple as milk, which is a staple in these homesteads. And, you know, dealt with these realities, often meaning they go a day without maybe a meal or their children missing out of school, the women are coming up with ways to survive the tough times. And whether this is through organizing themselves in small groups, I think I've shared an image there where there's a group of women seated, and these groups, they contribute the equivalent of $90 monthly to buy food supplies, or whether it's finding alternative means of income, such as exchanging for income or for food supplies, mineral salts that are found within their environments, or exploring different ways of farming, whether it's keeping poultry or different things that are not exactly being impacted on by climate change. And as an organization whose entirety is built around facilitating the best conditions for these women to express themselves, we, as I mentioned earlier, we are exploring partnerships that can hopefully bridge this gap. And one such partnership this year has been with the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, which is being supported by Global Affairs Canada. And it's so encouraging to see that there is need for grassroots voices to be listened to in terms of the climate action. Where through photography and storytelling, we're training women from underrepresented communities in Kenya and Ghana with the hope that they will have more meaningful participation in the priorities and planning for national adaptation. And what I really love that I keep, hearing is empathy and bringing these human voices in the fight. And I especially love something that a deputy director from the National Adaptation Plan Agency in Ghana said, is that this program will hopefully allow us, the communities that are affected and governments, to speak the same language. As you noticed earlier, I said that we speak completely different languages between the women and we who are championing for their cause. We speak a different language, but hopefully by having such programs and with them being able to share their perspectives, then we can all speak the same language about climate change and how to deal with it.
It's amazing that you say it's a shared, how do we get to a shared language? And that's the power of photography and visual medium, right? Because you don't need to know how to speak it. You look at an image and it's hard to deny something's happening. I'm very curious as to how you're recruiting the women that you're working with, and are you working with a specific age demographic? Because I know that, in the climate movement, the way that people interpret what's happening, I imagine in your community, is varying depending on the age demographic. So how are you dealing with that? Are you going for anyone who wants to pick up a camera? Are you looking at students, teenagers, adults that may be wanting to get into journalism? Who's your audience? Who's your demographic?
We have a bit of a different recruitment process for the different countries, specifically based on the gap that we feel is in that country. For example, in Ghana, we feel that female journalists are, there are not many, especially female photojournalists are not many, and therefore we target young women who have aspirations to venture into the field. In Kenya, we have applied a different approach where specifically with this climate change program, we have had diversity in terms of age. So we have one that is as young as 18 years old, and we have one that's at 37 years old. And what you get to see is very different. Their perspectives are very
I think Lydia's going to join us in a bit. Are you still there? No?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Take it away.
Oh, sorry. And I think what this does is that when we bring all the stories together, is that they are able to tell a very conclusive story. And the approach is also different in Hong Kong, where we work with migrant workers, where the age is also varying. And mostly we target especially women who are interested in talking about their own plight or breaking particular stereotypes associated with where they come from. I think that's the main underlying way that we try to recruit the women that we work with.
Well, I
Hopefully, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, I mean, hopefully, and I'm spilling beans here, but then hopefully in the future, we are also aiming to work with schools within such communities and see, how that works. And hopefully I can share an update when that happens.
I have no doubt it's going to happen, especially with you at the helm of Lensational. I'm going to give you the floor for one more second to ask if you could have a partnership of your dream. What's the partnership that you would like to develop?
Oh my God.
Whitney, you're really putting us on the spot today.
Oh my God. Wow. I would love, without mentioning names, but I'm hoping that people can, fit within this. But I would love a partnership that allows us at scale to reach as many women as we possibly can in each of the countries that we work and in the countries that we are interested in, because we are telling stories of barely, maybe 10% of the women that we need to be speaking on their behalf, or rather representing with their stories. And therefore, if any partnership can come through that will support us to do that, I will be mighty happy to partner with them.
Lydia, I hope to keep you happy. Everyone heard it. You guys heard it. We've got a few minutes. I had we can go to questions now, actually. A woman very eager. Go for it, absolutely.
My name is Johanna Zuleta, and I have a question for Josh. I would like to know what is happening with these projects you have done, if there's a connection afterwards with policymakers or with the corporate world, and also how could the general public engage with not only understanding but towards solutions? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I mean, we are so lucky to have Hannah Fairfield as our climate editor at the New York Times. She came from a background of graphics and of information, of organizing information to get it into the hands of our readers. And one of the things Alice and I have discussed is the platform that I have at the New York Times has such an immense reach that that's the way we're trying to get these stories out and create that kind of connection between the people that are actually at the front lines. And as Jack's documentary alluded to, it's not the richest countries in the world that are feeling these effects. It is the poorest that are at the front lines of these effects. And that's why it's been really important in our work is to get to these communities, to try to work with them to highlight stories from within. Solutions is a much harder question visually for me, and something that I've been wrestling with for years now is how to bring this same kind of dynamism from the human stories to the solution side. And that's something that we're constantly iterating with at the New York Times. We spent a year looking at cities and with our architecture critic, Michael Kimmelman, looking at how cities are being designed to anticipate the world of the future. And that was really effective in trying to show what places like Rotterdam is doing to embrace climate change rather than to stop it. So they recognize that our world is changing, and they've been able to adapt the whole makeup of their city planning to adapt to accepting the water that is inherently going to come at greater and greater scale over the years. So they have drains built into playgrounds in the middle of neighborhoods. And so it just looks like a playground for kids to play in. But there's a terraced structure and leads to a drain to be able to take the water out because they know it's going to come in multiple times a year. And so some communities just want to block it out and are still thinking that we have time to stop this progression. And I know as everybody is finding at COP this year, that's going to be less and less likely. And so I think that is something that we're going to adapt our storytelling to more.
Thank you. Another question.
Thank you so much. My name is Martin. Alice, I had a question about how you and the team at Earthrise integrate the voices and perspectives of the people whose stories you're sharing, and how that work goes, and how you allow them, you pass the mic and you let them share their own stories on your platform. Thank you.
Yeah, that's, as I mentioned earlier, human stories is what we're really passionate about, because that's where I feel, certainly for me, that was the heart engagement. Through my own experiences, meeting people in the refugee crisis, I was like, well, if I care about the people that I've met through this work, I have to care about climate. Seat at the Table is a really great example. That was a project that was born out of the idea that we're not hearing enough human stories, and we're not hearing from those disproportionately impacted, most impacted, and living on the front lines. So that is a series that is focused on bringing their voices to COP, and that's what we've been doing this past week, is getting those voices in front of world leaders. Literally, we have a room in the Blue Zone where we have the portraits, we have the voices, we have the images of those people, and a meeting room for world leaders who have been taking meetings in that room, with the hope of engaging those world leaders from a heart perspective too. On Earthrise itself, not enough. It's one of the things we really want to move into. We're starting to move into video content, and we're really hoping that through that we'll have a series of presenters across the UK and across the world making their own content, and so we become a sort of facilitation network. But essentially, these are the questions that we're asking ourselves. How do we tell different stories? How do we empower different storytellers, break stereotype, engage people from a heart perspective, and take action? We haven't done this storytelling properly, clearly, given the situation that we're in. So I don't have the answers, but I will make it my life's mission to work out how to get people to engage with this issue.
Thank you, Alice. Another question.
Thank you very much. Tom here, Cross Magazine. This is more a question for Josh, I think, but your 15 years at the New York Times, how have you found media engagement with tragedy in poorer parts of the world has changed? Because historically it's had quite an issue, and I suppose this links to your question, exoticizing tragedy, and as much as you're trying to tell the personal narrative, you sort of end up creating this depersonalized media. So just any thoughts on your experiences would be welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if while I'm talking we could load that last photo that I have of a woman planting mangrove trees. One of the things that I wrestle with is the aesthetization of this tragedy, and that's something that it's a difficult thing to reconcile. And part of what I'm trying to do is invite our readers in. And so if you can do that with a compelling image and that gets the conversation moving, then I'm more and more okay with that as time goes on. Is that image up on the screen at all?
Yeah,
Whitney?
You've got it.
So this is something that I think a lot about when I'm looking for the picture that sort of sums up what I'm trying to do as a photographer, because this looks at a solution, as Alice was talking about the nation of Kiribati, and this is in Kiribati in North Tarawa, and her name is Tabuena. And she is out there as part of a group of 10 women in her community planting this front line to climate change of mangrove trees along the edge of their island to try to create a buffer for rising seas. And so this image, I think, combines the personal story with that it does aestheticize what is going on, but at the same time it makes you look deeper at the story. What is compelling her to have to take this upon herself rather than the world leaders addressing this at scale? And that's sort of where I've gotten with my photography.
Alice, I'll ask the same question of you. What's your image of hope? And if there is one image that you could showcase for the world leaders here this week, last week, what would it be?
My image of hope is those that we I believe, and that we all should know, are the real climate leaders, and that's the indigenous communities. I wanted to show this. This is a campaign we've just done. We've put on billboards across Glasgow.
You can clap, it's okay, we can clap, it's all right.
And the absolute highlight of my COP was having Celia and Sonia, who are two of the women featured in the billboards, come, and we did a whole photo shoot in front of them, and they were beyond excited, and they said, we've just got to get this in every airport across Brazil, Sao Paulo, Brasilia, Rio. But I think it holds a really important message. If 80% of global biodiversity is nurtured by indigenous communities, why aren't they given a proper seat at the table? And that's really the message that I would want to leave everyone with. And I want my storytelling to be focused on platforming, amplifying, and celebrating the true superheroes of the climate movement.
Thank you, Alice. And Lydia, your image of hope, what would you say?
I wanted to share this image with women helping one of their own rebuild a house that had just been, the roof had been carried out away by strong winds. And I want to show this because this is what happens when we come together, especially with those affected, is that the solutions are more sustainable that way. And I believe that this is reflective of what needs to happen, just in line with what Alice is saying. These are the real climate leaders. We cannot have a climate movement for those affected without involving them. And if this is indeed our last chance to build better, we're gonna need to build with them together. So yeah, that's my last image.
Well, thank you all so much for your incredible work and your integrity of your work. And thank you, audience, so much for being here with us today. Please stick around for the remaining of the sessions today, which will be incredible, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.